Okay, Math 1, Unit 8, Section 11, we're explaining the meaning of slope. These are very similar to some of the PSAT and the SAT questions. A lot of those questions on there, they will end up having all kinds of data here. Then they'll have a little question at the end. And the big issue for these kind of problems is deciding what is important, what is not important. So on the first two, we have 4 problems total. On the first 2 problems, I'm going to read through the whole thing, and I'm going to just go through it slowly. On the last 2, I think I'm going to try to speed it up and go a little bit faster. So starting off, reading the first paragraph. By examining past tournaments, it's possible to calculate the probability that a school wins their first basketball game or first game in the National College Basketball Tournament. And then we have our chart here. Second paragraph. Each school's rank going into the tournament is a strong indicator of their likelihood of winning their first game. This can be expressed as, and then they have their equation there, where X is their rank out of 16, and Y is the percent chance they have of winning their first game. And then we have a graph. Now what they did here is they took this table, and then they found a best fit line, which we might talk about more, a best fit line. They plotted the points, and they found a line that goes through them pretty good, and that's called a best fit line. And then they graphed that, and then you can also see the data points. Now the real question is, what does the slope of the line represent? Right? So what does it mean whenever the slope goes from here to here? Like, what does it mean whenever we go down and over? Like for our rise over run. Now, if these are free response, you have all kinds of different ways you can answer it. But if they're multiple choice, you kind of would want to read through your multiple choice options to see. The way that I'm going to do it, because it's free response and I just get to write in it, the slope is a change. So I'm going to say, well, it's the change. And I'm going to look at my graph here, or my graph. The probability of winning the first game and the rank. Change in probability of winning first game. And then I could either use the word versus or the word for. Sometimes I want to use the word versus. So change in the probability of winning first game versus change in rank. Right? What I said there is, if we go back to our rise over run, rise means the probability, and then the run is the rank. So what I said in words down here is I said the change in probability of winning the first game versus the change in rank, right? I just had my 2 fractions there. And I know this might be like a, well, duh, but they sometimes can get wordy and they sometimes can get confusing. But that is an appropriate answer. You need to somehow say that there's change. You could say that there's a subtraction or an addition, but the word change is normally what I would use. And then you need to talk about both axes. You could have grabbed the data from over here in our table, the rank versus the probability, or you could grab it from the actual graph. Either way is good. All right, number 2. Daniel collects coins. Over a 3-year period, he collected 1,000 nickels. After organizing them by year, he found that the number of nickels for every given year was related to the number minted that year. And minted means created. So he's talking about how many coins he has versus how many coins were created that year by the government. So we can see our data there, minted by 100 million, and then in his sample, in his collection. So second paragraph, Daniel discovered that this can be modeled by the equation, and there's the line, where X is the number of nickels minted in a particular year in hundreds of millions, and Y is the number of nickels from that year in his sample. So what does the slope of the line represent? Well, we could say the very stereotypical line that we did last time. We could say, well, the change in the number of sample versus the change in the number minted. But I'm going to try to word it just a little bit different, just so that we have some different ways to think about it. This time, I'm going to say, well, every time we move to the right, we find more coins. So I'm going to say, well, the addition of nickels, or I'll say the additional number. I'll say additional, that'll make more sense. The additional number of coin, I'll just use coins, from a year All right. So the additional number of coins from a year that we would expect to find in our sample, right? So this one, it talked about the horizontal axis a little bit more. We talked about the number minted, the additional number of coins created, right? I could say created in there, or minted would be the more correct term, from a year we would expect to find in our sample, right? So again, these are very open, free response questions that you can kind of decide how you want to go about them. Whenever they're multiple choice, I think it makes a little bit more sense. And I think if you go and look at the homework, I think you'll be able to get it more. All right, number 3. Now, as I said at the beginning, I'm going to try to go through these a little bit faster. So I'm just going to kind of skim over the data. And for me, I'm going to look at I'm going to ignore this. Actually, you know what? I'll read that, and I'm going to pretty well ignore that. Households can consume much more electricity when the weather is warmer. Well, no dip. So we have our temperature versus our electricity. If we look at our graph now, right, I'm trying to do it quickly. We have our temperature, and as our temperature gets larger, our electricity gets larger. So what does the slope represent? The slope represents the additional electric consumption. For every EVERY additional temperature. I'll say degree. Right? As we look back at that, the higher we get on that slope, or what the slope represents, is how much more our electricity bill goes up, or how much electrical consumption we have. Right? So you can almost ignore everything except for the graph. So let's look again. The cost of a flight is related to the distance traveled. Well, yeah, that kind of makes sense. I start looking at my graph over here, the cost and the distance in miles. So what does the slope of the line represent? So I'm going to say, well, the slope, and I normally talk about the vertical axis whenever I write it. The slope talks about the additional cost versus miles flown. Or I'll say additional cost for every mile flown. For every mile flown. Very short and sweet and to the point. So I looked through the number 3 and number 4 a little bit quickly, and I understand that. I hope that kind of makes sense to you, that we can kind of look at just our graph there. Because all these problems are going to show you all the data that's listed here. You will have a T-chart, and then you will have a graph. Looking back at number 1, number 1's the only one that I use the word change. Normally, what CUDA will do is they will describe it with change if it's a negative line or a negative slope. That's not always going to be the case, but that was the case in this one. A lot of the times, if they're positive, they're going to use the word additional. And I tried to word mine similar to the way that Kuda will word yours, will word the multiple choice. So hopefully this makes sense, and let me know if you have any questions.